Really pleased to welcome Dorn today. He's a farmer, a researcher, an author, the founder and director of Open Team, which is the open technology ecosystem for agricultural management. I have to have my paper here because there's a lot of acronyms and I can't remember all everything that goes into them. So he's also a co-founder of FarmOS, which he'll talk about, the Farm Hack Community, and GOAT, another great acronym, which means the Gathering for Open Agricultural Technology. Dorn has also been a very active voice in the soil health movement. It farms in New Hampshire and holds a PhD from the University of New Hampshire in natural resources and earth system science. And I don't know if you brought your books, but his most recent book is The Great Regeneration.
I have copies if anybody wants them for later.
We'll get them later. Great Regeneration, Ecological Agriculture, which sounds like a great title. So Dorn's work really sits at the intersection of the technical architecture of how agricultural knowledge is produced, shared, and owned, and then the political question of who that architecture serves. Commons enabling infrastructure is not just an interesting design problem, it's a strategy for collective autonomy. And one of the things I really appreciate about Dorn's work is that he's doing the work of building tools, platforms, repositories, processes, and communities of practice that really embody the principles he advocates. He's not just theorizing the commons from a distance, he's farming, coding, organizing, and building from within it. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dorn Cox.
Well, first of all, it's fantastic to be here. And I feel like part of this is about building community autonomy, but it is also about reimagining the institutions that we build to do things together. And I think the Institute for Agroecology is just a wonderful place to host this dialogue. So it's a great question. It's a great honor to be here and have this dialogue, which I hope is part of something that we can continue. Before we get going, I want to just pose this question and take a moment. Who controls agricultural knowledge and why does it matter? So there's a lot there if you dig in. What do we mean when we say agriculture? What do we mean when we say agricultural knowledge? And what's the history of humans and agriculture in terms of what are we building on? And we're asking so much more of agriculture now. In the last 50, 75 years, we've started to use agriculture as an industry term. Agriculture is about food, fiber, and energy. But really, if we think more broadly, agriculture is part of our shared human endeavor. It's multi-generational. We're building on what we're the other half of nature, right? So we're building on what nature has already created for us and creating reciprocity with that process. And so it's a public science, it's a generational science. It requires a different kinds of systems approach. And it isn't just about the science, it's a social science. It's, I've joked in the past that it's not rocket science, it's way more complex. Because if you think about it, we're doing, the biogeochemistry is everything from the microbiome to the biosphere. If you're working on the farm, it's hydraulics, it's remote sensing, it's, biogeochemistry, it's genomics, if you want to go that way. And it's sociology, and it's political science. All of those things are actually part of defining agriculture. And so if we're thinking about agroecology is a concept that actually brings that all together in a meaningful way and puts values behind it and says, what does it look like in a community to actually start to build that? And so the question that I want to explore here today is really, we can ground it in Vermont. Is like, what does it look like for agroecology infrastructure in Vermont? And what does that look like from a shared tools, open knowledge, and data sovereignty and food sovereignty perspective? Because this is sort of the balance, is that this agriculture is both this thing that we all do together, and it's intensely local and personal. And that's inherent in our definition of what we're building and needs to be part of the architecture. And maybe we're contemplating that today, but this has always been true. from the beginning of seed saving and development of breeds and domestication, farmers have always been stewards of this shared knowledge and passing it on in different forms. If you think we're now doing it in these digital archives and seed sharing libraries, but that's how we got here in the first place, right? Is sharing knowledge with our neighbors and then often sharing it globally. I mean, this has been the, pick any domesticated variety, potato or corn or horses. Like, you can go back in terms of our human history and its effect, and been done brilliantly by both sociologists and historians. But that's sort of the nature of, as we're thinking about agriculture, defining us, and we're defining our relationship with nature through that process. And I think that's what it feels like this moment is so important, that we need to reconnect with that broader meaning. So what is that? And just to sort of from an institutional perspective, sort of some ambition, like when, in terms of the social aspect of agricultural knowledge, I was talking to the historian, land rights historian, Joe Gouldy, at the formation of FAO after the Second World War. The ambition was post-colonial. How do we equip all of the nations of the world to become food sovereign? And one of the main things was mapping the world's soils, not because of agricultural productivity, but for land redistribution and equity. And how do we create more independence through appropriate access to tools and technology? And there was, I think, 69 heads of agricultural departments for 6 weeks gathered together to imagine what was possible. So I just ask, with all of our current potential resources in abundance, what's our ambition? What do we want to do? And what might that look like if we organize, maybe not around nation states, but how do we organize around our regions and food security from that perspective? So the vision I see is sort of Vermont and New England as a region, as a living laboratory for what it might look like to create both this global knowledge and local production concept. And how do our communities adapt and thrive on our own terms, and use the best possible knowledge? So to do that. So why does it matter? I think it is existential. I think it is how we define ourselves through our food and our communities. And so for me, agriculture is the beginning of that conversation. So just a little bit about me, as I said, I'm active at our local food system in New Hampshire. We're just about 2 miles from University of New Hampshire. And as much as this is global, this is also any one of us can go outside and we can gather seeds and exchange them. And these are just some examples from my own farm in about a half an hour over one summer, gathering some of the genetic diversity that we have all around us. But again, sort of tying this into both history in the long run, I grew up really enamored with the idea of the Whole Earth Catalog. And then obviously we had the promise of the internet, but each of these are just variations of this longer term goal of how do we build on generational knowledge. And so in my own work, sort of, going back to the innovation of the printing press, one of the very first uses of the printing press was Diderot sort of creating the first encyclopedia. And the thing that did that was unique was this crowdsourced. It was the precursor to Wikipedia. But there's more than 20,000 articles, thousands of authors organizing knowledge to do this. To assemble the knowledge scattered on the surface of the earth, demonstrate general systems to the people with whom we live, and transmit it to the people who will come after us, so that our descendants, by becoming more learned, may become more virtuous and happier. Pretty exciting. Like, it seems so present now. And again, given the tools that we have access to, how are we not doing that? And I think that was the excitement at the origin of the internet, and the founders of the internet had this idea that it would be curated. But what we found is that the public internet, the curation, the quality of information became an afterthought, as opposed to the reason and structure by which we actually built it out. And so that's the promise of the next generation of tools and technologies, is to do that with intent and to maintain that integrity, rather than saying, oh, we'll get a public Wikipedia or Internet Archive on the back end and maybe it will be supported by industry, instead of saying that's the purpose of this infrastructure. Let's build what we want. And it's telling that one of the first things that the encyclopedia did in 1750s was to document all of the agricultural knowledge at the time. So I think this is FAO tried to do it. I think it was limited in its capacity. I think it's worth giving a try again. And we have, again, I just can't help but put this up here, like our public science and our ability to see the world has just exploded. So the way in which we can describe what agriculture is, and this genetic diversity sitting on our abundant little planet in that pale blue dot is just incredible. And our ability to examine it in detail from the landscape level down to the mitochondrial sort of cellular function is just unbelievable. And I feel we have a duty, if we have the ability to observe at that level, to be able to share and make that knowledge accessible. And again, there's the urgency from a climate perspective of having this knowledge to transform our environment in a positive way. And so as Anissa said, a lot of my work early on was about soil health, which is the ability of soil as a living organism that's dynamic and sensitive to our management. Well, then it's not about resource scarcity, it's about knowledge scarcity, about how we increase the diversity, genetic diversity. The main thing about healthy soil is living organisms. And the big thing there is managing complexity in our local environments and making that a healthy living environment. And it has a positive feedback loop. The more healthy the soil is, the healthier we can make it faster. And so there's an urgency that here from a climate and from a resilience perspective, from an economic efficiency perspective, that really drove me. But how did we get here? I've sort of talked about this transformation a little bit of the corporatization, the enclosure of agricultural knowledge that happened in the last really in the last 75 years. That it became intellectual property. And this has always been part of agriculture too. There's some that try to enclose and protect aspects of it, but even more so recently with the protection, they're fighting in Kenya, the ability to even save a seed. This is not hypothetical. There's the true enclosure of some of these shared resources. And we've seen with that, the right to repair, the ability to even maintain equipment that you were using to manage your own land has been under attack. And it's the definition of extraction, right? And so what we're imagining here, again, with the advent of open source tools and technology, is a transformation of that system. And so I'm going to try to give a few examples that I've been most close to and sort of point to a few others, but primarily FarmHack and Open Team and the Grassroots Innovation Assembly. But again, the diagram on the right, just for that sort of organic looking root structure, that's sort of an illustration of the current state of the internet. So which has a very organic form that we're building. And so ideally, we're moving again from this fragmented, protected world into more of what Austin talks as sort of the polycentric sort of network. So again, why now? This is, in addition to the climate urgency, it's no secret that we're in a political transformational moment from a political perspective. And this is also not new. A lot of the knowledge systems and library structures for knowledge have often been under attack. So, and this is, I just pulled these, one of the projects that I'm actively involved with is called the Agricultural Knowledge Concordance Project, which is coupled with gov.data and the Harvard Berkman Center for Internet and Society and Code for Science and Society. And there's the other groups like the environmental Open Environmental Data Project, all of whom are under attack at this moment. They're basically an attack on truth, the attack on the underlying access to knowledge, and real data sets, and the people associated with those data sets being displaced and corrupted, and the risk for having that knowledge actually be lost in meaningful forms, and it's of course deliberate, and so this function of archival preservation is, again, I think we have an opportunity again to both name it and start to take direct action to protect that. And so that's what the Agricultural Knowledge Concordance Project has been gathering and mapping the living atlas of the existing knowledge and data, but also the people associated with it, and then identifying the civic infrastructure that can hold that can outlive some of the challenges that individual academic institutions or certainly federal agencies that we've put our faith in. And this is not just the US, this is often globally that we're at risk. So we now have democratized access to tools for archival purposes, and sort of saying, what does it look like to take world's knowledge and put it into our public libraries, into our conservation districts, into our individual farms, and hold this knowledge that can now largely exist in an individual, in a single $300 server with a terabyte drive, but then make that protected and backed up amongst a network. So that's what this idea of the Knowledge Concordance Project is starting to, through a discipline focus, to make this publicly accessible knowledge, both that's curated, it's amendable, it's also robust against manipulation and corruption and destruction. And so thinking about what does that look like? But the first step is actually participatory mapping. How do we map ourselves, find each other, and make sure that we're mapping those together? I'll start to provide some examples, but why does this matter here right now? Because it actually is the foundation of our agricultural knowledge and the science that we actually need on an individual farms. From a Vermont perspective, we need access to the knowledge and the equipment to transform our farms for what comes next. Access to local innovations that we can access not just from our neighbors, but globally. We were talking about in a meeting yesterday about farm hack events that we'll talk about more later. How do we transform or repurpose some of the existing dairy infrastructure for other value-added production within? And there are examples of small-scale value-added production from around the world. In India, they have incredible spice processing equipment. It's the right scale. We've pulled in our own farm equipment from all over Southeast Asia, from different for different aspects. How do we tap into that and what already exists in our local communities? And that's, I think, really important for inspiration and attracting the next generation. So that's sort of the case for where we are and some of the motivation and inspiration for why now and here. I'd like to shift to some examples that I've been most close to in terms of what's being built, so we can see where our individual efforts can be mapped to what exists. And then the invitation at the end is to make sure to add your work to that map, so we can see how they all fit in together. So we're not alone in this. I'm going to talk about the projects that I'm most involved in, but around the world, there are farmers and technologists building alternatives. And this is, again, I think, part of the case to be made that the patterns that we see locally for agricultural innovation are sort of internal. There's sort of global human patterns, and that they will manifest in different ways. But we have the ability now to connect in meaningful ways in solidarity these different local efforts. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that means from the Grassroots Innovation Assembly for Agroecology, but in general, it's about the ability that we can create systems that anyone can use, modify, and share, and that we have practices around our governance that allow us to work together on that and document ways in which we can share without losing autonomy. So these are a few of the examples, and I won't go into all of them today. You've heard some different acronyms. Each of these are working at different scales, at different aspects of that, but they each provide different parts of that enabling that infrastructure. And I'll talk a little bit about FarmHack, which is very much about the on-farm needs assessment and documentation and culture, community culture of data gathering and sharing. Knowledge concordance I just talked about from an archival perspective, and how do we actually create the sharing infrastructure. Open team about some of the specific tools related to that. Linking in with other allied communities. This is really important. So the gathering for open science hardware, and then I don't have up here, but the DWeb or the distributed web internet communities that are really values aligned, but we don't have to do this all as farmers. Is that, again, as we think about agriculture as a shared endeavor, this is really key, is that we're allied with all the other disciplines, because everybody actually lives on Earth, right? Everybody eats, everybody wants clean air, everybody has a sense of security from what agriculture provides in their community. And so creating pathways for collaboration across those environments. So gathering for open science hardware, I'll talk a little bit about, but this is an effort out of Geneva at CERN, but really global for that transition in culture related to the science of at all scales. And so these are a few examples, but what they have in common is that they're all parts of this more broad circulatory system of knowledge exchange. And I try to put this slide in every presentation I can, because it really speaks, at least to me, about the vision of what we're imagining here, which is this. And this slide here is a circulatory system. You see the heart at the center, so a community club, and then it's circulating through farms and soils and so forth. And you'll pardon the farm imagery. This was from Sears and Roebuck, Encyclopedia of Practical Farm Knowledge. Also, thousands of articles all aggregated together with cross-referencing and so forth. Very much an update to that the earlier versions of it. But this was documenting the idea of organizations like the Grange. And so it's very much about that time period, but I think the metaphor stands, and the broader trajectory of agrarian communities and the idea of this virtuous loop and learning communities of receiving from all ideas, information, and inspiration, and giving to all ideas, information, and inspiration. And so and then there's a living infrastructure to make that happen. I think that's important. And the other thing that I think is really important is that the inspiration is listed there as everything else, is that it's not enough to just share the information, is that you also need the inspiration for change and transformation. That's social, and that reinforcement. So that's something that is sort of a common thread across these different tools and communities, is that there are communities as much as anything else, and that they can see each other and they have distinct roles. So if you think about a circulatory system and you study it, it isn't just the heart, it isn't the vessels. There's every part of it that is actually an important function that works as a whole, as a system. And that's what I feel we're doing right now with efforts like the concordance, is to map that full system. So what is FarmHack? It's one of those pieces. And I would say FarmHack, if you look at the vessels, is out in the field, it's at the farm, it's about data gathering and what works. How do we create that inspiration and that culture of identifying the tools that are actively being developed on the farm that work. And that was, again, this was formed initially with the MIT Development Lab and National Young Farmers Coalition. It was part of the Greenhorns movement. There was a big sort of local food movement, the early days of Maker Magazine and Fab Labs and so forth, and a lot of energy at that time. I was a younger farmer at the time as well. But it was really this idea of how do we put that, recognizing that more innovation happens on farms than in anywhere else on earth, and how do we actually put our engineering programs and needs assessment in service of that, and create documentation and support and discipline around bringing more resources to problem solving at the farm level. And so from there, we hosted, we started to create infrastructure in partnership with a lot of the open source communities, and began to build some of what's now evolved into some of the enabling infrastructure we'll talk about here. But the other thing that we really recognized was sort of like, what does it look like to put into practice that inspiration, that it isn't just enough to be developing the tools that work. We also have to create that environment that actually is inviting all those other non-farmer allies and is joyful, and that we're also learning new skills, because the technology and the knowledge isn't enough. You actually have to translate that into action. And how do we make that process accessible? So farm hack events became a place to do that. They're community events. It was about building skills, learning how to weld, learning how to solder, learning how to do a group build that actually built tools that are then useful. And then a chance to have those successful examples and that inspiration. So that community club circulatory system put in pressure. This is kind of what it looks like. So events, gathering folks together, but not just to listen to a lecture, but to do. And to eat and drink and grow and make, and that this is actually a joyful effort. And in fact, that it doesn't, like building organizations can be joyful, governance can be joyful. And that's a really important sort of, I think, not extra. I think that's a really core insight to, I think, the potential success of this work. And if you look back to those community clubs, that was a core ingredient. It wasn't that you're going through just rituals and Robert's rules. You're also, there are social events, there are dances, there's music, there's art. And so that was, this was like our reference implementation, a prototype of what that looks like. And so here are some of the different variation of the first set of events around the country that we started hosting. And you can see the unique nature. There's some commonality, but they're adapted. And this was true, I was saying, and it spread. There were UK events that had no direct coordination, and yet they were echoes in the communications and informal connections between these events all over the world. And it's still, I'd say, still reverberating. And it was like, I can't think of much that happens on our farm that isn't some way influenced by farm hack events in some way. I don't think there's any purchase that we've ever made or any project or that hasn't been influenced in some way. And so just from a personal perspective, it was the foundation of our conservation district lending program and which tools we were getting and why. And, there's a subsoiler we fabricated locally based on the yeoman's plow from Australia. We have, combines of different scales that came in and we studied and are still being studied and remanufactured potentially locally. BCS lending trailers were, all came out of a lot of this work. And so, and that's all sort of at the, from a local perspective, but the key here is, again, participation. Even as we build physical infrastructure locally, how do we exchange that? How do we not just go to an event and then have that be the end? How do we continue that conversation? How do we build on each other's effort? And that's different than just open source and we publish it and it's available. How do we intentionally document what worked so that others can also learn from it? And so that's, and build on top of it. And that's it's a different design challenge. It's different. So the initial website, based all open source, you can download all these tools for free as well. But the key is like, you can add a tool just like contributing to Wikipedia and comment on it. And so we have hundreds of tools that are up there, but again, it's not in isolation. There's a lot we could go into the nuance of and ethics of documentation and attribution. But this is what we're in the process of right now, is actually updating that website with newer tools that are both easier to use, but also add a lot more sophistication about the contributions and the different kinds of contributions, from innovations in how to build it, and the parts materials, the local adaptability of it, the ability to not just update the tool itself, but add how it's used in different ways, and really getting into the depth of what that looks like and access the community conversations about each of these tools. And really thinking differently that tools are not something that you have to buy and then get customer support for, but something that is part of a community that develops it and is providing those support. So it's a different approach, but part of what we're also, as we, I think, get more mature and sophisticated about this, is also recognizing when you start to have a lot of tools from a lot of different perspectives, they're all trade-offs. How do you make a decision? How do you find what's actually relevant to what you're using? And that doesn't take long before it becomes daunting. And any of us in any technology conversation, it's exhausting. Because we were just at MOFCA and we had a whole morning of tech presentations, and from even from my perspective, I know most of those tools and they all just look like maps, nice shiny maps with things you could click on. What's the difference between them? Why would I choose one over another? And what does it mean for our own operation? And am I contributing to something that I want to be part of by joining this? If I want to opt out of sort of the big world, what am I opting into and why? Those are all, I think we're all struggling with a lot of that on a daily basis. And so this has been something that has been a working group from the Grassroots Innovation Assembly, but we've been starting to translate it into a tool that I'll talk more about, is sort of ethical technology assessment. So how do we actually do something like what Consumer Reports does, is like apple to apple comparison. And this is part of an effort that we started with, also that sort of built on the effort within Open Team for what we call the Fair Tech Registry. So if you imagine, like, you can go to Apple Store or Google Store, how do you actually search and find the tools? Right now, it's actually really awful to try to find what you're looking for and which you choose. But the idea is, like, we can help provide a filter for the ones that have ethical considerations in terms of what you should use, what's leading towards greater food or local sovereignty, and our values alignment. And so that's essentially the idea here, is beginning to create a way in which we can ask those questions and compare. So that's sort of the framework for FarmHack. And then the next step, and we're in the middle of actually a UVM praxis course to explore some of this ethical tech stack in a very particular way. But from a FarmHack perspective, we're looking at this apples to apples comparison and how we can share, how do we create those criteria so that the work that we're doing primarily in North America can be shared with the other efforts around the world. And so if you go to the Grassroots Innovation Assembly website, you can see all these other registries of tools that are very similar. In some cases, thousands of tools, and others, just a few curated tools, but incredibly well documented. But there are issues of how do we again aggregate them? How do we share them with appropriate attribution and with the appropriate consent and intent? I'll just note that folks like L'Atelier Paysan in France, they are very particular about how their tools are used. They're really intended to be only built by farmers or their communities. They're not intended to be mass produced and manufactured. That's the intent. So that's not necessarily the case. We have other tools on FarmHack that are now manufactured at large, or put out by Johnny's, or by I'm trying to think some of the other tool manufacturers, some of the toolbar standards and so forth. So it's really important to be able to gather that. It's not, And that's, again, the importance of that rating, that ability to say it's not wrong, good or bad necessarily, but what's the intent? And it's really important to make sure that we're preserving the intent of the creators. And that's why open source isn't enough. So we want to cross-pollinate, but it's also important to all that diversity, but with the intent of how that sharing is actually stewarded. So this gets into what's the actual infrastructure to support that intent? So if we want to say that, and so this is the idea of community enabling infrastructure or commons enabling infrastructure, because it isn't, it doesn't happen on its own, and it isn't just enough to have the technology. We also need to have the technical infrastructure, of course, to be able to, those interoperability standards, the open databases, multilingual tools. But we also have to have a legal and ethical framework. What are those license agreements? How do we manage those? Because even if it's technically interoperable, if we don't have consent that's interoperable, you still can't exchange. And that's, and you think about all the different jurisdictions between exchanging seed information from Kenya to the US, for example. What are those agreements and that are going to actually enable that exchange to happen? What are the social norms, the regional governance, and what are the social contracts that we're creating with each other that are enforceable even outside of legal? So even if legally you can do it, if you are undermining the trust in our social agreement for how we are actually in community together, that's also really significant. And if we don't pay attention to it, we'll get into trouble as well. And what we see is that there's this much longer history of social contracts, and ritual and protocol that we have that I feel like we have to sort of regenerate as a species in a lot of ways in terms of how we're in community and governance and what are some of those pathways for doing that. And so we have some ideas about what that looks like as well. And then, of course, we need sustained financing to sustain that infrastructure. And what does that look like? We didn't build the internet the first time thinking about sustained financing of that infrastructure. We said, well, maybe the internet is sort of based on commercial activity and we get the public good as a byproduct. What does it look like to actually fund it so that it is the primary good? And so this is sort of the core to maintain that. Luckily, a lot of that infrastructure is becoming a lot less expensive, but it still needs people and attention. And so some of the outputs that we're currently building, I'll show you some examples. I talked about, already showed you a few innovation registries that we're starting to connect in together, but beginning to build that consent and attribution system for, and then licensing and sharing agreements. So FarmHack is tackling a few of these itself. So like you said, the global tool registry, starting to build. So right now it's built on, it's on a cloud-based server that distributes the registry. We're now in the process of building a couple different systems, but where people can actually host the registry on their own computers. So peer-to-peer direct network hosting. So there are potentially an infinite number of copies that are out there, but also starting to build dedicated hardware to support this and build a pathway from a centralized server that has all the backups. How are the ways we can build redundancy into that? And we have more sovereignty and ownership over that infrastructure itself. We're in the midst of doing documentation work and building compendiums and printed work of the tools that work and that are generated by it and covered by the communities. Also, this is part of the social sort of norms as well as the technical, beginning to build collaborative calendars. So again, this is this network of community organizations that all interact and are different pieces of it. It's incredibly important to be able to coordinate and see each other's effort. So a calendar is like one of those really core things. And so that's something that is actively happening. And that's partly for online events like this, So I think we cross-posted this with Grassroots Innovation Assembly, and it's on the Farm Hack calendar. It was also listed in the Grassroots, on the Knowledge Concordance calendar. But again, this is something that each of your organizations can also have some part in. It's like, how do we actually meaningfully see each other's work and contribute and cross-promote? So that's part of the civic alignment. And we're also seeing that one of the big issues that we have structurally is the effort. There's work in documenting this and sharing. And often the communities and the individuals that are at the edges and driving a lot of their community innovation and development aren't necessarily the ones who are there. The skill set, the disposition isn't the same as documenting. And there's also a huge opportunity with institutions to learn and to engage from a documentarian perspective. How do we bring more resources and support into documenting and sharing back to those communities? And so organizations like Honeybee Network in India have a whole culture that's based on the institutional sort of and the sociology of documentation and linking with universities, engineering students and agriculturalists and designers who are trained to show up appropriately, to engage and to provide value back to the communities that they're documenting, and to elevate the work of the rural communities that are doing the innovation. And then we're working on this funding lab for open ag tech, which is recognizing, again, part of the sustainable funding is also shifting how we make funding decisions and resource allocation to the projects that communities value, and shifting and creating regional and topic in funding pools that are specific to the community needs that are governed by the communities. And it's a shift in thinking about how we fund commons development, which is a challenge to a lot of the traditional philanthropic work. So, this is, I'm going to shift a little bit now to some of the specific tools that will come back to the licensing and some of those other issues that Open Team has primarily been tackling. So the goal from an Open Team perspective has been sort of on the balancing, again, the tools and technology to balance that agriculture is both a private enterprise and local, and also this public science, and linking the different types of tools, from decision tools and adaptive management to observation and remote sensing, and recognizing that ultimately all of that value comes first and foremost from the farm, and everything else is a transformation of that value. And how do you architect tools that are based on that? So this is a theme, just from a different, if you just take the same set of content and just think about it now from a technical perspective, from a science and research perspective, how do you then build environmental markets? Well, it has to start from intrinsic value at the farm level first. Geolocated data with consent. Like, how do you have high quality studies without all of that in place? So research and development is based on high quality farm level data. How do we do that? Well, we have all these different government programs for incentives that we balance between practice funding and outcomes. All of that is still based on what's actually working at the farm level, and how do we create that system. And so it's fundamental to democratizing access. So we talked about this already in terms of what the knowledge concordance is doing and making it durable, but what that looks like from an actual data entry perspective is starting to show data sets with an assessment score related to that. Like, what's our confidence? What's the quality of it? What's the ethics behind that data set and how it was collected? And including the communities that were stewarding it, its interoperability and integration, and again, this consent and sovereignty notes are all part of that ethical collection of the data at the farm level. And so the concordance work right now is going through an interview process of identifying all these different data sets, where they live, and mapping them together. So we have this living library and atlas of that data, but also the tools that are used to collect it. Just to give a sense that this isn't all in theory, that this is also possible. And some of these things that I'll just speak from personally, like navigating complex licenses, even a couple of years ago, even 6 months ago, it's really challenging. We had a 9-month process, multi-stakeholder design process. We call them collaborathons to develop consent management systems. We just in the last month, turned it into this license engine. So how do we choose the right license for software, data sets, or hardware based on your intent? And so now you can walk through a set of questions and choose the existing licenses, but then you can also add, I think it says down here, custom builder. You can also add conditional use agreements and clauses based on your intent. And then it will generate your individual license. And because it's gone through this, if others use the same, you can actually start to compare. And then you can start to see a registry of which tools meet your requirements, or which data sets or which data standards are going to be suitable. And then likewise, we're now have built out the sets of questions necessary to generate those scores and validate them and update them based on peer review or ecosystem sort of steward. So to be able to walk through, so the entry, what are the minimum requirements, what are some of the data ethics and interoperability assessments and commons and access requirements or variables for software, hardware, and data sets. So those are examples, and what it starts to, and we're starting to, this is also in process with an open team, but sort of make the projects that are doing that work visible. So these projects that I just showed you were part of the FairTech registry project. And so who did it? Where was it? What's its current status? How do we connect with the people that were actively doing this? So we're starting to make, again, the past work with an open team more visible. And so this is sort of the idea of a registry of projects that that we can map both, these are the ones within open team, but we can make this same format available to others. So we can actually start to see projects that are aligned with one another and build on each other and reference in a way to more easily reference it. So this is what it starts to look like from the Farm OS perspective. This is a farm management and record keeping tool, has a standard common farm convention for sharing activity results on a farm. And you can go to the website and see all this information, but you can also see how does it fit into the broader ecosystem? What are the communities that are based on it? What are the other related tools that it interoperates? And then what's in, and if I were to choose to use it, how does it score related to other projects? So what's possible? So those tools are all in process. Now is a chance to sort of think a little bit forward. So I just want to encourage the idea that we can be ambitious about what is possible. A couple of years ago, I was at the Oxford Real Farming Conference, and there was a lecturer, Guy Standing, who was talking about the origins of commons, of the idea of the Charter for the Forests, which I didn't realize at the time was the foundation of sort of commons law or common law. And the foundation of a lot of our current constitution was based on what's the role of the state in protecting our access to shared resources. And the forests was, the intent was that the agreement in the Magna Carta or in the Charter for the Forest was that the sovereign's role, the deal, the social contract was that the king actually had to protect the right of the citizens to access the forests and the common resources from enclosure, from the merchants, and it needed to be ratified every year and read in the square so that it was kept current. So there's all these, I'm going on a divergence, but the idea is that this is part of the fabric in which we're living, but we don't necessarily have access to some of these same tools that we've been based on it. So a refresh. And so the question at that conference was, what about a charter for agricultural knowledge? That this is a shared resources, and what does that look like? Because we probably need to refresh a charter for the forests globally. We need a charter for our global resources like the oceans, but also agricultural knowledge. And so this was, and this language was a first pass and is now in some form in the charter for the Grassroots Innovation Assembly for Agroecology. But it's really two parts which are in tension. One is that everyone everywhere should have access to the best possible knowledge to steward the environment and improve their communities and livelihoods, and that food and data sovereignty are both inalienable individual and community rights, and that all knowledge contributed to the commons needs to be with consent attribution without coercion. And it balances these two aspects together, both open and also ethical and addressing individual sovereignty. And I think they aren't, it's not contradictions, they're in tension. And I think that's a really core function of this mutually dependent independence that we're addressing. And again, it's not impossible, but I think codifying this and thinking how many organizations could use this as sort of foundational social contracts for how we work together and recognize that this is a way in which we can organize together. And that in doing so, that we're moving into a different kind of governance. I want to make this case that so much of what we're doing that are civil or public goods are called nonprofit, or they're non-GM, non-governmental organizations, or they're called, it's part of civil society, which is this other process. And I think the case here is to be made that community governance organizations, or CGOs, are actually central and they exist, but we don't have a good language to describe that they're not what they aren't. They are something very particular that needs to be elevated. And so what does that look like? So I would make the argument that things like Wikipedia and the domain name registration and a lot of the internet governance are an example of this. Mozilla Foundation, each of those are examples. But what does it look like if we were doing that for other domains in science and technology? And we have examples, you can point to them, standards organizations and so forth that are doing this, trade organizations that maintain a lot of this, but we relegate it to this other category as less important with inaccurate language to describe its function and importance. So I just want to make that as part of this process of moving from the sort of creating these tools and communities around around trust too. That the other aspect of moving to a corporate nonprofit structure is it's all based on the assumption that to prevent fraud and abuse, as opposed to creating productive civil engagement and mutual benefit. So it's all about conflict of interest instead of confluence of interests. So what does it look like to actually create organizational structures that are actually built on interoperability and mutual benefit? And so this is what I would say is part of what comes next. And so we have examples again, public libraries, cooperative data banks are examples that I think we can start to build on. Our civic infrastructure, particularly again, conservation districts and public library networks, I think are wonderful examples, not because they're perfect and they're doing everything, but they are physical infrastructures in space that have alignment, that have been formed with a lot of those structures in place that just need to be elevated. So I think we'll just about wrap up in 2 seconds. So yeah, so in closing, I think we have a vision of shared equipment and knowledge exchange and commons management that can be brought together. And we're not starting from scratch. A lot of this exists in different forms. And Vermont is a wonderful place in a region that has a lot of this infrastructure already in place and is functioning with a lot of that history and and resources to do that. So we can certainly build more of this together and build on that local strengths through open farm documentation and innovations and adapting our designs that work and our sovereignty practices and participatory governance. And why now? I think some of that is self-evident. We have this unique opportunity, I think, when systems are stressed to have a greater willingness to collaborate. And when resources are threatened, we can also look around to find other ways. And so I think that's an opportunity that I think we can, even as much as we're, a lot of what has been built is under threat, I think we have the opportunity to rebuild in new ways. And so, and again, we're not alone. And we're not alone now, and we're not alone in history. So this is a quote, at the beginning of the French Revolution, that agriculture is at the roots and commerce is at the leaves, and to the roots, the remedy must go. So, and so that's it. So the idea is about more participation, and that these are not all the solutions, but there are parts of the puzzle, and the intent of each of these is to build something that others can build on top of. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Dawn. It was such a rich presentation, so many ideas, and like I was already thinking about like the relevance for the region, these goals like producing so much more food regionally in the region, and how that's measured, and the kind of data systems that we have don't actually capture like all the food that's being grown and produced, like not just in commercial farms, but home gardens or the seed saving. And what if we had our own way of measuring that we designed and created and held with our own benchmarks? That's just one application. So we've got some time for questions now.
Well, and I'll just share just for fun on that front.
Yeah.
In our own farm and system, we just went through this process of trying to get a new point of sale system, and who's going to do the processing, the inventory system. And we used the tech assessment, and Square came up as like 58, and we found another one that was like 82. And then we realized like, oh, we can use the open source one that's 82 and build our own. And in a week, we now have the exact system that we want that we can share. And so I shared it with Martha, I think, the other day. But yeah, so that's the example of once we have this, we can go a lot faster and better and lower cost. Like there's just incredible potential for actually, grounding this work into, and so this is for a self-serve on-farm store. Never be cost effective to have a commercial entity build it for us, but now we have exactly what we want. So anyway.
No, that's awesome. Thank you. So like I said, we've got time for questions, and we've got some questions online as well. So does anyone, are there questions online already, Andrea? Maybe we'll start there and give you a chance to think about any comments that you want to share.
The question is, how far are you in the development of the ethical technology assessment, and what was your intention of developing it?
Yeah, so I would say we have a version 1 that's usable right now, and we're just entering right now, part of the practice course is starting to enter tools into it to test that rubric or whatever, that set of questions and scoring functions for software, hardware, and data sets. So we have the first, we have an example of applying it directly to about 140 tools with USDA in terms of the first pass for USDA Fair Tech Registry. But it's testable. But the intent is, and this again came out of part, I would say, give attribution specifically to the work of the Open Team conditional use agreement work and the development of a series of social contracts like ag data Bill of Rights and agriculturalists' oath of care. There's a whole bunch of sort of standards that led to those questions. So that part is fairly mature and it's working as a tool. Like you can generate, I can share the link with you and you can review and generate your own scores at this point. But I think we'll probably in the next 6 months or so get to a version where we'll have a registry of tools that have been peer reviewed based on that. And then it's a matter of setting up the culture of versioning those questions and that assessment. So I would say we have sort of a version 1. Was there another part to the question?
Just what the intention was of development.
Oh yeah, and so this came out of part of the Grassroots Innovation Assembly for Agroecology Working Group was specifically a technology assessment framework because it came up, every single group had this issue, both for the tools they're developing, but also for the tools we're using to host our communities and evaluation. So how do we actually choose? If we say we want to opt out of Google and Amazon and Meta, et cetera, what are we opting into? And then how do we assess those trade-offs? And so the framework, that was the beginning of the work, was to create a framework for helping to make those decisions. So some of what we'll be doing in the next week, even, I think we're going to be evaluating, Google Suite and Proton Mail and self-hosting and others to evaluate those trade-offs as we're making, so we can make more educated choices related to the tools we're using from there's huge advantages to some of these collaborative platforms for community organizing, but what are some of those trade-offs and how can we get some of those same benefits without making some of the trade-offs in terms of data privacy or sovereignty from a technology perspective. And some of it is even our ability to adapt it to our own specific use. So even if it's perfectly secure, but we can't change it to make it be responsive to us, that's also a trade-off. So that was the intent, was saying, if we want to opt out, how do we opt in?
Yeah, the participatory technology assessments as also thinking about as a pedagogy, because I think lots of people are grappling with these different technologies and having it as a tool for dialogue amongst people. I know when I've recently had a dialogue around AI, I learned so much, and having a tool like that as a reference point for thinking about different technologies. And so is the intent of this also, because I know it's embedded in a collective process, but I'm curious about how it might be able to be used as
it can be absolutely. I mean, I think that's the potential, is to have it be standalone, and you can have registries based on different assessments. I mean, it was partly inspired by actually some of the folks who are working on AI assessments, because there isn't just ChatGPT and Anthropic. There are dozens, and some of them are very much developed by indigenous communities and they're local hosted. It isn't all about building global data centers to use these tools. There are other pathways. And so part of this is also showing, and by showing it, that it, like, one pathway isn't inevitable. We have these other options. And I think that's part of the pedagogy, as you said, is like, how do we sort of create that dialogue around options? But some of it is benchmarking in the case of AI, running a number of different models on the same set and then showing how they're different. And then also, how are they hosted? How do they use data? How do they protect data? It's the AI conversation is very present with and motivating, I think, a lot of the knowledge concordance work too, in terms of creating data sets that aren't necessarily just crawlable by every AI also, to be able to protect and steward the quality of what we're getting back from those at work. So it's a really important use case.
Do we have more online? Another online, and then we can go to Gabby where we go back. Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go for it.
Another one online from Niels. At what point does the creation of this kind of tool tech data commons help create the basis for regulating private intellectual property rights, which are so predatory in global capitalism, neo-colonial structure.
No, I mean, that's the data sovereignty and so the other part of commons is that it isn't about unmanaged, it's actually creating a structure to create those social, technical, legal agreements around how we share. So that's what this conditional use agreement is about. And one option, there are lots of ways to achieve that, but fundamentally it is about what is your intent and how do you want to share? And so that's what those agreements are all about. And then how do we enforce them? Because they can be forced partly socially, partly technologically, and also legally. I think we're stuck with this idea that, it's either patented and enforced or it's not. And in fact, we have all these other tools to potentially create, and that's part of what this infrastructure is about, create those different mechanisms for enforcing that. And it's not just copyright law. There's a whole group that's focused around how do we create, enforceable community charters and use trademark law or other efforts if you want to keep it in the legal system. But there are other ways in which you can enforce it socially. Like you can turn somebody off, if you host your community data and they're not abiding by your code of conduct, then they're out. I mean, this is part of commons, this is part of the commons structure is that graduated enforcement and your ability to say you're in or out is a really powerful tool. And we can enforce that partly technologically, but we can have social elements to it. So it's a really important question, and that's absolutely what this is about. Even as we're talking about, sharing any one of these technologies or innovations that are being shared between, say, like I mentioned, the example in France. But we were in Kerala in India this fall, and we had every range of willingness to share across groups from all over the world, and they're all different. And so that's the important is to make sure that we're capturing that intent and then being able to enforce it.
Yeah, I think, and to that point, commons doesn't exist outside of it. The community that's stewarding that commons. That's
exactly right.
They are in relationship, and specific to that relationship is what the commons is.
It is actually the enforcement of that boundary is what makes the commons. Otherwise, it's just an unmanaged resource. Yeah. So I think that's the key. But the difference here is that we're sort of the additional layer here is we're trying to build tools to make that easier to visualize and to enforce.
Gabby and
thank you so much. And you actually already answered part of my question. I was wondering about the vocabulary and the meanings, because a lot of this infrastructure, words.
The language is tough. Yeah.
I was wondering how you navigate the part of the language, because you were mentioning, for example, license, but then the meaning of it,
license or
commons
contract
might take a different. So how did you navigate that part? Sorry.
I love that question because that's such and I'm speaking in an academic environment to some extent. So but one of the really important aspects and one of the first things that we're also building is also a visual glossary, simplified glossary, a translation glossary. And some of it is also, across vernaculars within disciplines and so there's a huge body of work to actually do that translation work that isn't just, from a multilingual perspective, but from a community cultural perspective also. Even the use of the commons language is often very off-putting to a lot of people, even if they're doing it and living it. And so this is I would say one of the largest challenges is actually creating the language that's appropriate to communicate these different concepts across cultures and communities. Even as some of this feels intuitive and there are examples that people are using in their daily lives. But I would say, that language structure, and yet there's no way around actually getting to the full ontological depth. And that's what actually makes a lot of this possible, is that you actually are capturing the real meaning and then the layers of the language on top of that. But it's a whole other, like there's a group called IC Foods and UC Davis that's sort of their whole reason for being, is building all of the language structures, the ontological sort of frameworks for this work. And it's food and nutrition, and it goes all the way down from the scientific to the sort of the community scale.
My question actually goes pretty well with that. I was going to ask, you have a lot of, or you talked about international partners. I was wondering if you work with any groups that work with farmers with more like limited literacy, and how these kind of open source technology platforms.
Yeah, there are wonderful examples of that too, and especially in India, because there's so many languages. And that's actually a really fascinating ethical use case for AI, for translation, and how that's actually handled. But there's a tremendous amount of, and how do we use that without creating more extraction and so forth. But I think there is a case to be made for democratization of exchange through these tools, as long as they're done and used in an ethical framework. But digital green is an example, is sort of on one side of that for sort of farm knowledge and decision tools. But Polynova and Honeybee are absolutely international groups all over sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia that have been collecting, and without internet. A lot of this has been done in pamphlets and in publications in local languages and sharing through that. So there's a much longer history of that innovation sharing, and we're in the process of like, how do we make that more accessible? And this is a question with Polynova, which has this 30 years of collecting on-farm innovations, but the digitization and translation of that with the consent of the original innovator, how do we do that? So that's a project that's currently happening with Internet Archive and Polynova.
Did you say,
Yes,
Polynova?
Polynova, pro local innovation. It's a fascinating network, but they're one of the founding members of the Grassroots Innovation Assembly, and we're basing a lot of the governance structure actually on what they this very federated governance structure.
Do we have any more questions on that?
There is one more online. I'm curious if there has been much engagement with seed governance systems. I know that we've learned a lot about the imperfections of implementing open source seed initiative approaches and realizing the values we've hoped for with alternative IP structures.
Yeah, so I would say the groups that I'm most familiar with, it comes up, and I'd say I'm personally one step removed, but it's absolutely part of the conversation. And there was particularly a lot of activity around seed sovereignty in Kenya, for example, most recently, but there's certainly others that are really active in that area. I would say, yeah, so I think, yes, and there's more connections that I think still need to be made, and there's a lot of communities specifically focused on sort of the seed, not just seed sovereignty, but seed lending library concept to make those seed archives living. And it's something we're actively involved. I'll just say personally on our own farm, we're working with our conservation district and connected with Cornell on seed saving equipment and lending, creating the infrastructure for lending libraries for seed saving. So I'm familiar with it at that level. But I know one of the conversations, say, with the Knowledge Concordance is like really even thinking about, say, the seed vault, as opposed to just that's one of those things that is, that's some of the response is that we can't have these centralized in, it's, and to be safe, because we know with conflicts around the world that a lot of these often are vulnerable. So how do we make this seed knowledge really living? I'll give you another really actually pretty fun example that's actually current. IC Foods, who I mentioned, and Prolynova, they're collaborating on a project called 10,000 Grandmothers. And it's about capturing, and you'll get the connection to the seeds in a moment, but it's really about capturing recipes in the cultural context of specific varieties. And that if you go to certain areas like in Korea, when you talk about a Korean soybean, there are actually thousands of varieties and they're specific to specific recipes and times of year. When US created Seed Bank, they have all the varieties, but not the cultural context. And so that's the other part of the data that's really rich and meaningful. So it's great to have that genetic material. When do you use which, and what's the history of that? And that's really the cultural part that can also be expressed in sharing. And so the idea is to start to create some more of that richness and the cultural meaning of the seeds in context, both not just from growing from a commercial crop, but what's the cultural context and the flavors of the recipes that are tied to that are actually part of what sustains it. Because if it doesn't have that context, what's the value? It's just sitting in storage somewhere. And so I think that's part of this other aspect that is actively going beyond just the ability to exchange seeds. What's the way in which we're actually, the richness of the sharing as well.
Anyone else in the room?
I was curious if there are any tensions that arise from having a federation governance structure, because that's still a hierarchical governance structure, which is the same one that we have that produces, agricultural knowledge the way that it's produced, which is really exclusionary. So are there any tensions that arise from that?
Well, and that's actually, it's a big reason why grassroots innovation assembly for agroecology, because it's actually a way, it's a forum for exchange, but not governance. So it maintains sovereignty of and it's a core part of the governance structure and charter, is that it is intended to do things that we can't do individually together, but only those. And that the point of it is actually to distribute the power back to, and that's, I think, part of the charter structure that's so important, is to make sure that that's codified.
Yeah.
Because there's a tendency to consolidate power, but so we have to be really vigilant and intent on that. But I think there's some language in learning to build on that. But I think that's always going to be a tension, I think.
Right. Yeah. I'm just curious about how tensions like that are handled or whatnot.
And I wouldn't say that it's all solved. I think that's part of but I think what we're seeing is that some of these tools, when we're intentional about it, they're often very complex.
Yeah.
Or and some of the things, it's projects like MetaGov or you might have used Polis, or some of the consent some of these ways in which we can elevate the perspectives of the members into governance decision and visualizing that to help make better decisions. I think it's more sort of this generalized pro-democracy tools.
Yeah.
I think is part of what's possible. And there's certainly a lot of activity around how to do that.
Thank you.
Maybe we have time for one more question. Margarita, are there more online, Andrea?
No.
No. Okay, Margarita, did you have your hand up?
I didn't.
No. Okay, Chris, please go.
I'm wondering what you think about incentives for data sharing. I know in academia, attribution of a citation is a valuable thing, but in other places it doesn't really mean much. And I'm really curious about some of the ways that are being concocted to redistribute value that comes from innovation back to all the data contributors down the chain that produced it. But I'm wondering if that changed the intent of the sharing in the first place. Similarly, with copyright licenses, I was wondering how you feel about them, in that, if someone's being legally coerced into sharing rather than
it's without coercion. You saw that was really important, that without coercion, because that power dynamic is real. And so that's, I think it's I think it's something to be constantly vigilant about, and that's a little bit about the idea of the license engine is giving more tools to people to choose the license that fits them best and meets the intent. And there's a huge range of motivations, and every project to some extent is different, but some of it is very much like, also, making it clear and easy for others to navigate those complexities and even change licenses over time. But it's but I would say we're certainly trying to create the environment first and foremost of reciprocity, with the expectation that by sharing, you're getting intrinsic value back by others building on your work. Like it's less costly to get a better solution if you're not doing it alone. Like that's the environment that's the sort of the ideal that we're trying to and I would say, at least personally, that I'm striving for. But it's not universally, it doesn't meet that's not going to be universally true. And especially if you're dealing with communities that weren't even thinking about licensing. And so I think there's a rich field of like how to navigate, how to ethically navigate that. I'm not sure that really gets at your question perfectly, but I would just say it's a very active conversation. I guess I would just say from a bit broader perspective, and I'll just speak personally, I guess, is that we generally want incentives to be from production and use rather than for protection. But we want to make sure that the attribution is part of, that there is social value, there is reciprocity for those contributions. So and that's a bit why we're talking about publishing also. So we can actually codify in physical form and celebrate really well documented work. And there's public recognition and celebration of work that's being used and reused. So really focusing a lot on that social reciprocity.
Well, thank you. I think we've got to wrap up now, time to close, but thank you again, Dorn, for taking the time to be here with us and sharing all the work that you're doing. And thanks everyone for being here and great questions and comments, and folks online as well. Thanks a lot.